Hello everyone and welcome to the Damcasters, and this is our 99th episode, which is frankly mad. So thank you so much for sticking with us for all this time, and we've got some fun stuff and changes coming up for the 100th episode, which will be out in a couple of weeks because we're going on a road trip. So we'll be filming episodes 100 to about 105 while we're away, and really excited about it, and I hope you're going to like what we're going to do. It's a lot of fun, and of course, if you want to know what all that is, join us on Patreon, where from just £3 a month plus a bit of VAT, you get these episodes early with a different intro, and you get to know what we're up to when we're making these videos and podcasts, because there's some changes coming up that everyone on Patreon already knows about. So there we are. Now this week we are speaking to Dr. Jan Davis, and she is an astronaut, but we are not going to be speaking about space this time because we're going to be chatting about her dad, Ben Smotherman, who was a B-17 pilot and a YB-40 pilot, lots on that as well, who was shot down and ended up in Stalag Luft III. And what Jan has done over the course of 2 books is recount the similarities between her life going into space and his life learning and preparing for combat and flying combat, obviously. And in this new book, which is called Airborne: Artistic Musings of a World War II Pilot and POW, she has reproduced Ben's war log, which is the diary he kept while he was imprisoned in Germany. And it's stunning because Ben wasn't just a pilot, he was an artist and cartoonist as well. So I cannot wait to share this with you. It's a fantastic chat with Jan about her dad. I have to thank our fantastic sponsors at the Pima Air and Space Museum, one of the great aviation museums in the world, and it's fantastic to continue to be supported by Scott and the fantastic team out in Tucson, Arizona. Get out there, ladies and gentlemen. It is an incredible place that I can't recommend highly enough. And if you can't, just check out their socials and their website at www.pimaair.org. AV Geek Mecca. But without further ado, let's get on to chatting with Jan, and we'll see you at the end of the show. Welcome to the Damcasters, brought to you in association with the Pima Air and Space Museum. I'm your host, Matt Bone. Jan, thank you so much for joining us on the show. This is your second book about your father, and as we were saying before we started, well, we can get you back to talk about that one in the future. But I was just really sort of, when writing this book, what did you sort of find out about your dad that sort of drew you to turn his war log into something that we all get to share with you?
Well, my father never talked about the war. He was a B-17 pilot stationed in England and was shot down in Holland on his 7th combat mission. And so he was a prisoner of war at Stalag Luft III for 21 months, most of it at Stalag Luft III until the March. But he never talked about it, about the war. I knew he was a pilot. I knew he was a POW. The only time he ever shared anything with me was when he pulled out his wartime log, which is a blank book that the YMCA provided to POWs, and he filled his with paintings and drawings and stories. He was quite an artist and cartoonist and drew well, wrote well, and he was painting scenes. While he was a POW, he was painting scenes in this logbook of being shot down. So several pages of watercolor paintings of him being shot down. No words, just paintings. And so he was talking me through how he was shot down in those pages. Those are the only pages I saw in the journal. And so I knew it existed. And I wondered what happened to the journal after my father died. And I asked my sister, she was someone I didn't really know because she was born after my father remarried, but she was the oldest of those children. And I contacted her through Facebook because she has an unusual name and was able to find her. And I said, could you please send a copy of this wartime log to me? I would love to have it. And years passed, we all are busy, and it was 120 pages. So, it's a lot to scan and send. But in April of 2020, I received it in the mail, the scan of this wartime log. And I was thumbing through that, and I thought to myself, it was during COVID. I'd retired, so I wasn't working. I couldn't travel. I was really kind of going stir crazy. And so when I received this wartime log, I said, I have to tell my father's story. And originally, I was just going to publish the wartime log. And then as I dug more deeply into his life and the research about where he flew, what airplanes he flew, what his training was like, I realized there were a lot of similarities between his career and his flying as a B-17 pilot, and his training and the risk he faced had a lot of similarities to my flying in space, and uh, the camaraderie and the risk, the training and flying in harsh environments. So I decided to write a book about both of us, which is my first book. But to answer your question, I always wanted to publish the entire wartime log because of its historical value and because it is so well done, and just a work of art, really. And after I had already started the first book, my sister called and she said, I found some more stuff. And so she flew down to Huntsville, Alabama, where I lived, and she had all of the penny cartoons, which he drew also as a prisoner of war. And so they were rolled up in a ball. I think he probably stuck them under his shirt or something during the march. And so I wanted to publish those also because that's history, and he's very well known for those cartoons. So that's a long answer to your
No.
question about why I wanted to write this book, but I really wanted to document what he had so well laid out in his wartime log, and then also tell the story as seen through Penny's eyes.
It is a fascinating read, and those watercolors he did of him getting shot down, you can feel it. It's him processing the experience and the clearly the trauma of that as well.
Yes.
When you saw those, how did they affect you?
Well, I knew he was an artist because after the war, he painted Western art
Mm.
and, horses, cowboys, Indians. And for my mother, he painted ballerinas because she collected ballerina figurines. He painted in oils for her. So I knew he was an artist, but I had no idea, even that he painted in watercolor. That's probably all he had available to him at that, and colored pencils. And I was just amazed at the quality of the art, and also the fact that he did this, as a prisoner of war. I'm sure it helped keep him busy, kept him, you know, sane, if you will, um, because that's the astonishing thing. Not only are they beautiful paintings, but that he did them while he was a prisoner of war and very unpleasant situations. So I was just astonished. And in the wartime log, he could not write very much, or he had to be careful what he wrote because of the censors, the German censors in the prison. And so in this book, I annotated what he included so that, it tells the whole story.
I realize we've not even said his name yet. What was your dad's name, and where was he from?
His name was Benjamin Smotherman, Ben Smotherman, and he is from Fort Worth, Texas. So he was born and raised in Fort Worth, Texas. My mother was from Dallas, and they met in college.
There's some lovely photos of them when he was passing out of flight training that you've included in the book, and they're delightful.
Yes.
We don't get to see this side of a Second World War pilots, the POW experience, and especially for Brits. When we talk about POWs, it's the Great Escape
Right.
or the Far East for the treatment of the men
Mhm.
over there. So to delve into this is quite interesting. But before we get into that, and the rather famous camp he ends up in. What was his Air Force career like? You said it was only 7 missions long, but it was an interesting one because it just wasn't standard B-17s he was flying either, was it? He had an interesting bird.
Right. He and my mother were married the day after Pearl Harbor, or excuse me, day before Pearl Harbor. And so that was a Saturday. Pearl Harbor was Sunday. And then he enlisted the January of 42 and started his flight training. He had already been a reserve cadet. And so he was full-time flight training January 42. So that was about 9 months before he received his wings, his silver wings at Lake Charles. And he was trained to be a fighter pilot. And at the time, we didn't have fighter escorts, really. We had the P-47, but we didn't have the P-51s or the fighters we had later in the war. And so the Army Air Forces needed bomber pilots. So they made him a bomber pilot, and he started his B-17 training. He did that mostly in Florida, and his combat crew training also in Florida, and was all over the country because pilots have to understand what their crew members are doing. So gunnery and navigation, bombardier, got some of that training all over the country. But as he was going through his B-17 training, they started a secret program with an airplane called the YB-40. And because there were no escorts really for the B-17s, the idea was to design a modified B-17 to be an escort for the B-17 formations. So they took a B-17, added another turret on the top. They added a chin turret underneath the front, underneath the bombardier area, and that had 2 guns on it. They added double guns. Wherever there were guns, they made it a double gun. And so it had a lot more gunpowder. It had no capability to carry bombs. They added extra armor in the sides of the plane to make it withstand combat. And so the idea was that the YB-40 would sort of lead the formation, and then when it was time to bomb, then the bombers would take over the lead and bomb the target. The problem was it was so much heavier than the B-17s when it was fully loaded with all these guns and armament that it could keep up with the B-17s. There's a lot of literature out there that says they could not keep up, but they could. But it was difficult. It was difficult on the engines. They had to increase the manifold pressure. And it was hard to maneuver a plane that large and heavy, and you want to be maneuverable when you're an escort. So it didn't really go as planned. In terms of the operational use of the YB-40. But anyway, my father signed up. It was all volunteer, the people who wanted to try this new airplane. So they had a secret location near Orlando. It was Montbrook was the name of it. And I learned this from Bob Doolin, who was a YB-40 navigator who I met when he was 105 years old. And he said that they wanted to keep it secret. So they slept in tents at this airport that was out of the way and cooked their own food and everything else. So it was a very secret program. And only 12 made it over to Europe, to England. My father ferried his YB-40, which was named Dolly Madison, the northern Atlantic route over to Alconbury, which is where all of the YB-40s were out of the 327th Bomb Squadron and the 92nd Bomb Group out of Alconbury. So he did fly Dolly Madison a couple of times. The first time he flew it, it was badly damaged. But then he also flew B-17s, and when he was shot down, he was in a B-17. So it's an interesting story. Not many people have heard of the YB-40, but it's an interesting concept.
You sort of think a heavy bomber carrying a heavy payload, when you just gun it up, it should be fine. But the fact is stuck so much in it that it made it quite slow and overly heavy is it seems counterintuitive in your mind if you were to just put it on paper. But an interesting experiment, and fascinating that your dad flew flew one for
Yes.
a couple of missions.
And
Yeah.
Bob Dylan also told me that the two turrets on top, the arc of the turrets had to be limited so they wouldn't shoot each other. So, but some of the things from the YB-40 did get incorporated into the B-17G, like the chin turret and the staggered waist windows were things that were a good design that they carried over into the B-17.
Yeah, fascinating story.
Yeah.
We did a whole episode on like a potted history of the B-17, and it came up, and it was exactly that. You try to do the math, but you're like, hang on, all this stuff that becomes the G, it had a good purpose. But there we go.
Yeah.
So your dad's final mission was to Kassel and the Pfizer factory there.
Mhm.
What happened? Because we're going to have you back to talk about more about your dad and him later, but we want to get to the camp because we want to talk about his comics, his cartoons even. So how did he end up, unfortunately, in occupied Europe?
So they had already bombed Kassel, and he was on his way back to England, and some fighters had cannons at that point, shot his number 3 engine, and either the damage from that engine hit the number 4 engine and took it out, or maybe there was another attack on that hit number 4 engine. So those two were out, and the number 2 engine was failing. They couldn't feather the 3 or 4, and so they had to fall out of formation. And when you're in a B-17 formation, you have to fall out. That's when the German fighters really would go after you. So they did go after him. Several of them. I think he said 9 different aircraft came after him, and I don't remember the number of hits they had. That was documented later. So he knew he was going to have to crash land. He couldn't land anywhere in England or ditch the plane in the channel. He wasn't going to be able to make that. So he was about to hit a town in Holland, which I have now learned is Wageningen in Holland. And he was about to hit that town, and he didn't want to kill the people there, and also do more damage to his own crew and his plane. So with 2.5 engines out, he managed to do a 180, and he remembered a farm he had just passed, and so he landed in that farm, crash landed in the farm. He says he thought he caught the tail wheel as in a fence as he was landing, so wasn't as smooth a landing as he had hoped for, but all 10 crew members survived and were not injured. Interestingly enough, I went to that landing site end of last year, and it's still a field, it's still a farm. And after he crash landed, they were instructed to put the plane on fire. So he tried to put the plane on fire, and that didn't work. It was just too badly damaged. There was really nothing to ignite. So he, there were 10 crew members, and they split up in pairs, and they decided to try to evade the Germans and head for the underground. The underground was in Arnhem, Holland. So that's where they were headed. And since I went to the place he landed, I could see the canals around it and the trees, and I could just imagine him hiding out in the trees. He said he was trying to rest during the day so they could run at night, and he did swim through some of those canals. So it's pretty exciting to think, when I was there, to think what he went through. So he was on the run for about 12 hours. He crash landed around noon and was captured around midnight, turned over to the German authorities. All of his crewmates were captured also and sent to prison camps, different prison camps. I'm not exactly sure where they ended up, but I know he and his co-pilot, who paired together, ended up at Stalag Luft III. So, of course, first they went to the Stalag Luft for interrogation for a few days, and then they were shipped by train over to Stalag Luft III.
And there's little terms that I've got the lovely copy of the book that you've sent over here, that just looking at the amazingly emotive watercolors that he painted of what you've just described. It's quite
Yes.
something. But very quickly, there's a wonderful term that I'd never heard, which was Kriegies.
Oh, yes.
They sort of call
Craigie.
these, and I racked my brain on it. I've never heard that before. That's lovely because it's just sort of this shorthand all the way through his notes and the rest of the book, and I just thought that was brilliant. And
It's a really long German word, and so they shorten it to Kriegies.
yes, the German word for computer. Yeah, let's murder some German, shall we? It was a Kriegies Farngurner. There we go.
Okay. And
I'm hearing my German friends screaming at me right now, but yeah.
And I'm a Kriegie kid, so offspring are called Kriegie kids.
Brilliant. It's interesting. So he's arriving into the American side of the camp. So just for listeners who are unaware, Stalag Luft III is huge. There was the British section where the British are doing things about the time that your father arrives, and on the American side, very much separate. No sort of comms between the two, and he sort of settles into it as well. And he's given his log that you mentioned before, and immediately starts filling it in. And I felt terrible because I was looking back at some of my notebooks. Nothing I have ever done is as neat as your father's wartime. Carefully penciled lines to keep everything straight. And
Right.
he is an artist at heart. So artist for pilot second, you can see, because the care that he puts into that book, and I'm jumping ahead now, but it's just everyone that he talks about in it writes down where they're from, home address, so that they can stay in touch. It's a wonderful feeling. But
Don Miller, I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, go for it.
Wrote the blurb on the cover. Was the author of Masters of the Air, and I showed him a copy of the book when we traveled to England with him, with Don, and he said it's the best organized and written log he's ever seen, and he was amazed also by the paintings, and other curators of other museums have said the same thing, and of course they would like for us to donate it to their museum. So we'll see in the future.
They would, yeah.
How can you apologize?
It becomes very quickly this almost like I'm trying to think of the right phrase for it, but this wonderful look at just the drudgery of life in camp, and the way Ben starts finding the humor in it, in the little sketches and things that he's doing. You can just see that they're desperately looking for a bit of levity, anything to lift the mood. And what do they sort of get up to? What are some of the things that he talks about? Because the two softball leagues, which I think the inter-series play of that must have gotten a bit tasty, but just what did they get up to try to pass the time as they waited?
Well, fortunately, the YMCA provided sports equipment, so they had leagues of all different sports, wrestling and softball. And my father talks in his wartime log about, I don't know if it's baseball or softball that they played, but they had a lot of other sports, and they had leagues. So that kept them busy, tennis, badminton, volleyball. You see those when he drew the drawing of the South Compound, he showed all of those things, the volleyball nets and even the fire pool they used for swimming. I understand the Canadians, when the fire pool froze over, they were playing hockey. And so there were a lot of sports.
It doesn't need to be a big patch of ice to get Canadians to start playing hockey.
True. And also the YMCA provided books for a library, and they taught each other courses. And in his journal, not this one, but one he wrote, no, I guess it was this one. It was either in the journal or some letters he wrote home. He talked about the courses that he was going to teach, and like wood carving and aeronautics. He was going to teach those courses. So they had a library made up of books that families had sent in, the Red Cross or YMCA had provided, where they taught each other courses. Also, they had musical instruments. So there were different bands who put on concerts, and there are pictures out there, and I have some in my first book of the bands. Also, they put on theater. And he, I think in this log, talks about how he helped build the theater, and they built the seats out of the wooden boxes that the Red Cross food parcels came in, and they had different productions of in this theater. So they of course, the Germans wanted to keep them as busy as possible so the prisoners wouldn't think about escaping, but also it was important for the prisoners to stay busy with these different activities, because it's a tough situation and they're bored, and so they tried to keep themselves busy as much as they could.
I found reading this fascinating because my good friend Tony Hoskins is the head of the Photographic Reconnaissance Unit Memorial that they're hoping to build in Whitehall, because he's recovered Sandy Gunn, who's a photo reconnaissance pilot that was shot down over Norway. And he was one of the great escapers and one of the 50 who was executed by the Germans.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're doing this memorial for anyone who flew PRU within the RAF, and also rebuilding Sandy's Spitfire, which is coming along nicely.
Wow.
And it was interesting sort of seeing round about that same sort of time that Penny's reaching popularity is about the same time as the British escape, and that just sort of made me sort of smile. The sort of the Americans too were working on escape plans and trying to get out as well. But that sort of interesting sort of timing, that sort of late 43, early 44, that your father's getting involved with the newspaper, is that the Brits are doing their escape.
Yes, the newspaper, The Circuit, was in the South Compound. The South Compound opened in September of 43, and so the people who were publishing the newspaper, The Circuit, there were other newspapers in the camp in Stalag Luft III, but in the South Compound, it was called The Circuit. They knew my father was interested in drawing and painting, and they asked him to do a comic strip for the newspaper, and the only criteria was that it had to be about a woman. So my father wanted it to be a nice girl, and so he decided to name her Penny, and that she was going to be a war correspondent. So she would be, with the troops at their different facilities, writing these stories as a war correspondent. And so that's how it started. I'll have to say she looks a lot like my mother did at the time. Blonde hair, blue eyes. And so he drew this. It's not clear to me. I've seen different numbers. The paper, the Circuit, was a large newspaper print that was pinned on the wall out by the common area where the Germans made soup. It was the kitchen. That's about the only thing they provided to the prisoners was soup. But anyway, so this big newspaper came out 2 or 3 times a week. Some say weekly, but I think it was 2 or 3 times a week. And so Penny was the original Penny cartoons that we have are about 6 inches by 14 inches. So they're quite large. And we have all 96 original Penny cartoons. So Penny became quite famous among the South Compound, and many prisoners asked my father to paint kind of a pinup picture of painting of Penny in their wartime log. And so several people have told me, oh yes, your father's painting of Penny is in my father's or my grandfather's wartime log. So, and I've seen some online as well. So that's kind of fun. But the war through Penny's eyes, as I said, is very interesting. But the guys, the prisoners in the camp said, we want more sex. We don't want a nice girl. And so my father created a roommate for Penny named Pat. And Pat was dark haired, and she was not a nice girl. So that's the rest of the Penny cartoons about Penny and Pat.
It's funny. It's that sort of very classic golden age. Penny wears light clothes. There's that Pat sort of dark haired, sort of like a Betty Page fringe before the Betty Page fringe comes in, and it's that sort of very clear opposite for it before we even get to the things that they get up to.
Right. Yeah. So
I guess the easy question here really is, when you saw them for the first time and you started going through them, what hit you? What did you feel as you started piecing together the Penny series?
Yeah, I didn't even know about Penny when I started doing research for the book. It wasn't until well, there is a mention of it in his wartime log, and I thought, oh, I just thought maybe it was a few cartoons, maybe every now and then. But when we retrieved the originals, I was surprised by how many there were and how well they were done, how well they were drawn, and the storyline. And I bet he had so much fun coming up with all these stories about Penny and Pat and drawing them. And, so I was glad to see that he kept himself busy with all of those cartoons. And I was also impressed because growing up, I had my parents' yearbook from when they were in college, and throughout it are cartoons that he did. So I knew he was a cartoonist. And so I was really glad to see that he carried this creativity into something that the other prisoners could enjoy and have fun and have, hope and think about home and think about the other people in the war and what they were going through, because that's basically the setting where Penny is. So I had a lot of emotions reading it, but mostly joy that he was able to do what he loved, which is drawing and painting and bringing that joy to other people.
Yeah, you're right. The storylines through them are just work so well, and it's that sort of classic comedy as well that everyone thinks they're going to get the upper hand on her, but she just manages to skate on by.
She was a strong woman for her time.
Yeah,
But
she's
you
brilliant. I
didn't
love her.
no.
Yeah, and it's great that they're all in the book as well. So everybody's going to get a chance to meet Penny and go on the adventure, because she
Right.
has quite a big adventure considering all that. Because I'm just trying to remember. I didn't jot this down. Didn't your dad miss the date of the invasion by about a week? He put it in early June when he was writing Penny. I think there was notes about that. He wasn't far off um, getting the D-Day landings correct, which raised a smile. And I knowingly had the date written down, and I cannot find it. It's not in the notes I sent you, so that's on me. That's my bad. But there's 96 strips. Is that correct?
Yes, the originals. There may be more, but those are the originals that we have that he had rolled up in a ball. Yeah,
Because I suppose we should really talk about that, because he rolled them up into a ball because he was on the forced march, which was no joke. So
right.
sort of early 45, they're all shipped out in the middle of winter, and he covers this beautifully in his log. But what happened to Ben as they started marching them away from the Russians?
And that's something again I didn't know about, and he didn't talk about. That must have been an awful situation. But in the wartime log, he did talk about how they were watching a play in the theater I mentioned. They were watching a play, and the senior officer for the South Compound, senior American officer, came in and said, "You have 30 minutes to get ready. We're evacuating Stalag Luft III." And there was some knowledge that they might have to evacuate, so people sort of had already started assembling sleds out of the Red Cross boxes and trying to save food if they could, and get ready in that way. So when the Russians were coming close to Stalag Luft III, the Germans evacuated the camp, the whole Stalag Luft III, and other camps as well. And this was like the worst blizzard and winter conditions that Germany had had in years. It was 0 degrees and windy, snowing, blizzard conditions, awful conditions. The men could only take what they could carry. And so I can just imagine he saved the wartime log, and he saved these penny cartoons. He rolled them up in a ball, probably put them in his shirt. I don't know where put the wartime log. Bob Doolin, who was also POW, said he put his, like in his pants, front of his pants. And the South compound was the last to leave. So they were waiting, outside, getting ready to march. And they were the last to enter the march along with thousands. I mean, Stalag Luft III alone was 10,000 people, and they had these other camps. So they marched in these awful conditions with as many clothes as they could put on and as much food as they could carry and whatever personal belongings they wanted to take. And this went on for a total of about 3 days. It's written very well in the wartime log where they went, where they stopped, where they were able to sleep, like in the glass factory in Moscow. But it was just awful conditions. Of course, they didn't have much food. They might have had some broth. I think they had some margarine to eat. But because it was so cold, a lot of people were burning their wartime logs for fires, for kindle for the fires. And thank goodness my father did not burn his, and it survived that march. People were throwing away their musical instruments they might have saved or books. They were tossing them aside because, they had to march for 60 miles and in these awful conditions before they were put on rail cars.
There's that heartbreaking bit where he talks about seeing the Moscow 3 kilometer sign again and again and again, and they just don't, just trudging and never getting towards where they are. That must have been so heartbreaking.
And then they went to Spremberg. They were marched to Spremberg, which is where they got on the rail cars. And he does not even talk about the rail cars in the wartime log. It probably would have been confiscated had he talked about that. But they were 50 men in each rail car, and they could only stand, and it was just awful conditions because it had cattle in it before the men, and so they were, didn't smell too good, and again, just terrible conditions and strict violation of the Geneva Conventions. They were taken by rail. His compound, South compound, went down to Moosburg, which is where Stalag 7A was, and other prison camps also evacuated to Stalag 7A. So Stalag Luft III was a Luftwaffe camp, so it was operated by the German Air Force. So they were well taken care of there, and they had, as I said, the YMCA and Red Cross supplements, and they were all officers. The people in Stalag Luft III. So the 4 officers on a B-17, navigator, bombardier, pilot, co-pilot, would have gone to Stalag Luft III. Non-commissioned officers go to other camps. So to go from that situation where they were, taken care of, not abused, they weren't allowed to work, to go to Moosburg, to Stalag 7A, which was not a Luftwaffe camp. And it was a camp designed for 10,000 people, and there were over 100,000 there sleeping in ditches. And it was just a terrible situation. They couldn't get food to them because the infrastructure in Germany by then had gone way downhill. They weren't able to get supplies and food to the prisoners. So it was a bad situation. So they marched, they got there early February, and so fortunately they weren't there very long, but nevertheless, it was a bad situation, really bad situation.
So they were liberated in April, and I think I did put this in my notes that I think my favorite little cartoon that your dad wrote is the soldiers saying, I can't surrender to you, General, I'm on KP duty. It's just such a soldiers look at you, go surrender to somebody else. This is done. It's his sense of humor still shining through all the way through this terrible experience.
He did several cartoons there about Stalag 7A, and he also did some cartoons after the liberation, which I thought were really cute, that, things that he could say so if he didn't have to worry about a censor.
Yes. Oh. So, okay, let's get to the important question. When did he get home to your mum?
So the liberation from that camp was April 29th. It took a few weeks to get things organized up at Le Havre, France, where the processing out of the soldiers and airmen and whoever was over there, they processed out the prisoners of war first. And so he was in Belgium first. He was flown to Namur, Belgium, and then from there he went to Le Havre, to the Lucky Strike camp, where most of the people were shipped out. He was shipped out on the Mariner Robin. I have just little pieces of paper like his luggage tag. That's how I knew he was on the SS Robin. So he shipped out in May and ended up in New York in early June. And they had processing there in June. And as you can imagine, debriefs and physicals, and they were issued new clothes and given their pay, their back pay, and then flown to for him flown to Love Field in Texas. So I have the telephone card they gave him in New York that told him where he was in line to make his one phone call in New York. So I guess he called my mother. I don't know for sure. There's no record of that, but I'm just guessing he called my mother. And so if he didn't call her, it was his mother. So those were happy times. And then he flew to Love Field and arrived there mid-June. I think it was June 16th or so of 45. So that was a happy reunion. He had a 60 days of leave, and then he was back in the cockpit flying again. Not B-17s, but he was flying other planes for the Air Force. He stayed in the Air Force, a career Air Force officer.
I think 60 days is a bit stingy, right? You've been a POW for nearly 2 years. You can have 2 months off and then get back at it.
Well, I'm sure he enjoyed flying again. Some of the pilots said they would never get in another airplane, after the war, but he loved flying so much. That's what he wanted to do.
Yeah, that's I love that little tidbit, that staying in, getting straight back at it, because you can completely understand with sort of a modern mindset that the trauma of getting shot down, maybe losing friends, you wouldn't want to even bear that again, and just the thought of it would be nothing. But he stays in. I've just looked at B-25s. It makes me happy any time I see a Mitchell. So that he went on to B-25s is fantastic.
Yeah, he flew lots of things in the Air Force after the war.
So the book is escaping into the wild. I suppose it's going to be Sophie's choice question now. Of the strips, is there one that always pops to mind when you think about them as that's your favorite penny adventure?
I think the one where, or the ones where she is approached, or someone tries to make a pass at her, and she figures out a clever way to get out of it and be a strong woman, which is probably kind of unusual back in the mid 40s, early 40s. So my mother was a lot like that. And I'm like that too. So I guess that's why that resonated with me.
I had no idea what to expect when Kayla kindly sent your book over, and I started reading it, and I was completely absorbed. And then you get sort of the sort of broken up into 2 sections with the wartime log, and then all the comic strips at the end, and it's just wonderful. It really is. So thank you so much for putting this together, Jan. And it's what a way to spend your time while you're trying to get home to your family, because it's this fabulous little look at Kriegi life.
Yes. Well, thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it. It was a learning experience for me as well, because as I said, he didn't talk about it. And my purpose in writing the book was to tell his story and to document this for historical purposes. And I was so relieved when I published it because I could breathe a sigh of relief that now other people can read his story and learn from it. As you said, there are a lot of names of, so he painted different aircraft in this wartime log, and then he had people who flew on those aircraft sign their names below the aircraft that they flew. So there are a lot of names like that. There are portraits of his roommates that he drew, like a charcoal drawings of portraits of his roommates, and addresses of his names and addresses of his 10 crew members he went down with in the B-17, as well as the names and addresses of his roommates at Stalag Luft III. So my hope is that somehow families of these other prisoners can see that and know what they went through. And I have spoken with some other Cree kids who said, reading what your father went through helped me understand what my father went through. So that's my hope, that not only will my father's legacy live on, but also that others can learn what they went through by reading it.
Yes. Well, I can certainly see that this will help them, because it's a fascinating look. What's the name of the book, Jan? Go on, give it its full title while we've got you here.
So it's Airborne, 2 words, Airborne, Artistic Musings of a World War II Pilot and POW.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for coming on, and thank you for sending me the book. Like I said, I thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm not just blowing smoke at it, because it was brilliant. Like I said, it was once you sort of start realizing what it is and seeing that, dear listener and viewer, Jan has reproduced the actual pages from the book with annotations, so you can see what Ben was writing himself. It's brilliant. Thank you so much for joining us. And now that I am recording, I'm going to put you on the spot. You will come back to tell me about space shuttles and going into space, won't you?
Sure. Be happy to, Matt.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jan.
Thank you.
I cannot thank Jan enough for joining us here on the Damcasters, and the book Airborne: Artistic Musings of a World War II Pilot and POW really is fantastic. The penny comics at the back are just brilliant fun. So do check that out. I've put all the links in the description below. In the US, the books are a bit easier to get. You can order them direct from Ballast Books. In the UK, the ebooks are available on Amazon. So check out the links in the description below. Do some Googling, because they are well worth your time. Now, like I said, we've got some changes coming up, and that's all going to be announced soon. Unless you want to join us on Patreon and get your name in the credits, they're about to roll. Check us out on the links in the description for that. And until next time and our 100th episode, thank you so much for your support. Do check in with your friends and take care of yourselves. Bye-bye, everybody. I just want to say many thanks to our fabulous Damcasters on Patreon. If you head over to our Patreon page, you can join the crew and get your name in the credits from just £3 a month plus a bit of ad. The Damcasters is hosted and produced by Matt Bone and is a Boney Abroad podcast production.